is a new chapter in their story and their identity. Thank you. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Jeremy Spoon, who you can introduce yourself, Jeremy, and our speaker. Thank you very much.
Aloha, mahalo, Auntie. It's an honor to be here and be part of this speaker series. I'm currently an associate professor of anthropology at Portland State University. It's especially meaningful to me to be part of this today because I received my master's and doctorate from Manoa and spent time on the Big Island collaborating with folks at Hawaii Volcanoes and in the surrounding communities on different projects. Leah recently received her master's degree from Portland State University's Applied Anthropology program. The following presentation is part of a larger project at Fort Vancouver National Historic Site focused on re-indigenizing the Fort Vancouver landscape. Facilitated by PSU in collaboration with representatives from culturally affiliated Native American nations and Native Hawaiian organizations, the project is creating a re-indigenization plan that proposes to the National Park Service various pathways to bring Indigenous voices into the governance, management, and interpretation of the area. We will integrate lessons learned from Leah's work into this effort. I now am excited to introduce Leah for us to learn from her research. Thank you.
Aloha, Leah. Are you ready?
Yes, aloha. Thank you all for that wonderful introduction and for having me today. So I will just go ahead and share my screen and we can get started.
Yes.
Okay. I'm really excited to be here to share my thesis research discussing Indigenous representation on government managed lands on heritage sites and cultural centers in the Pacific Northwest and Hawaii. In this presentation, I will discuss a little bit about me, the project objectives, context, understanding history and heritage, methodology, results and discussion, conclusions, and recommendations. Following that, there will also be time for questions. There may be some anthropology lingo in my presentation, so please let me know if you need anything explained at the end. I grew up in Washington State and studied applied intercultural communications at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington for my undergraduate degree. While in Pullman, I met my husband. We have a dog named Albie, who will hopefully stay quiet during this talk. I've worked in academic advising and led peer mentor programs at both Washington State University and University of Idaho. And this summer, I completed my Master's of Arts in Anthropology from Portland State. And through that time in the program and after, I have done anthropology work with the U.S. Forest Service Fort Vancouver National Historic Site and the Office of Applied Anthropological Research at PSU. Fort Vancouver National Historic Site, like many other heritage sites, national and state parks, and other ancestral Indigenous lands, has identified unequal representation in interpretive programs and a lack of recognition of the historic influences that maintain this. As people have become more aware of the past, this is increasingly more important to address. This project is a response to interpretation and programming needs identified in collaboration with the Fort Vancouver staff and connected Indigenous communities. The goal was to support the Fort Vancouver re-indigenization plan, and the purpose was to better understand the overlapping roles of Indigenous history and memory at public government heritage spaces and cultural centers, and how this influences the interpretation and use of these spaces in the past and present. I'll provide a brief background of Fort Vancouver for context. It was constructed in the 1820s. The site of Fort Vancouver was a place of travel, trade, and contact. The Hudson's Bay Company occupied the site for about 25 years, using it as an administrative headquarters and main supply depot. Almost all Pacific Northwest tribes, Hawaiians, Iroquois, French Canadians, British, Americans, and more were represented at the site. The Hudson's Bay Company was then replaced by the United States military and the Vancouver Barracks when the site was then used in exploration and various war efforts. The site now continues to serve as a travel destination and site of contact and cultural activity. Hawaii was included in this research because of the Hawaiian connection to the Pacific Northwest and the fur trade. Within 10 years after Captain Cook's 1778 landing on the Hawaiian Islands, they became an important contributor into the developing the Pacific Northwest, becoming a regular stop for ships for recreation, supplies, and repairs. As early as the 1790s, Hawaiians were joining ships as crew members, including those involved in the Pacific Northwest fur trade, often settling or working along the West Coast. Hawaiian employment ranged from Canada to Mexico and even some west of the Rockies and in England. The Hudson's Bay Company traded with Hawaiians, importing and exporting several goods, including coral, which was used for whitewash and mortar for the fort's chimneys. Hawaiians worked in a variety of roles, including both land and water-based work. And by 1849, the Hawaiian population outnumbered the French Canadians at Fort Vancouver. Some Hawaiians married women from local indigenous populations and had children, and at the end of their service, many Hawaiians returned home, but some remained in the Pacific Northwest, either re-enlisting, seeking other employment, joining their spouses' indigenous families, or joining other Hawaiian families, while experiencing the structural racism that was in existence in the US at that time, experiencing things such as refusal of citizenship. As the Hudson's Bay Company left Fort Vancouver, some Hawaiians moved north to Kalama and many moved to Canada. Today, Hawaiian heritage is visible throughout the Pacific Northwest, such as in place names like Kalama, Washington. Now that I have explained the Hawaiian connection, I would like to provide a broad framing of the history and heritage for a better understanding of the research. Accounts of the past typically do not tell what actually happened, but how the recorder of the event experienced it, often silencing or forgetting parts of the past. And commemorations of the past often exclude Indigenous experiences with historical representations framed through Euro-American perspectives. Often when absent stories are told, it is because they have been allowed. Heritage can be defined as anything that is important to people that provides a connection between the past and the present, including tangible and intangible culture. Heritage landscapes often serve as places of memory and belonging, knowledge holders, and identity negotiation for communities and nations. But they may also be sites of conflict, death, loss, displacement, and other traumas. When approached correctly, heritage can work to create a story of the past that recognizes and teaches difficult histories. Since this research involved Indigenous populations who have often traditionally been silenced or underrepresented, I used methods to help me decolonize the anthropology research process. My goal was to attempt to shift the balance of power toward Indigenous populations throughout the research process through steps such as using collaborative methods to determine the research goals, sharing results, and providing authority to all voices. An additional aspect of this was to ensure that communities and peoples were not essentialized, but recognized as different and unique individuals with varying roles and experiences. For my research, I gathered data to inform the creation of a synthesis of lessons learned, which informed my recommendations. I visited 12 sites that work to interpret the histories and memories of sites and serve multiple diverse stakeholders. Focusing on these sites and key knowledge holders, I used two primary research methods: participant observation and in-depth interviews. I conducted the data collection on two research trips, one in June and July of 2019 and one in August of 2019. And to analyze collected data, I used inductive content analysis. I selected a total of 10 case study and 2 supplementary sites from across the Pacific Northwest and Hawaii. Sites were accessible via 2 research trips, one driving through Washington and Idaho, and the other driving around the island of Hawaii. Heritage sites included Fort Simcoe Historical State Park, Nez Perce National Historic Park, Fort Spokane in Lake Roosevelt National Recreation Area, Fort Nisqually Living History Museum in Point Defiance Park, and Pu'uʻohonua Ohononau National Historic Park. Cultural centers often also served as heritage sites, and these included Sacagawea Historical State Park, Spokane House Interpretive Center in Riverside State Park, Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, and Pu'ukohola Heiau National Historic Site. One cultural center included the Volcano Art Center Gallery and Neolani Campus. Supplementary sites included Whitman Mission National Historic Site and Kamaka Kahokunu National Historic Landmark. My research looked at what exists at these sites currently and does not reflect changes and improvements that have occurred gradually over time. Additionally, some sites have newer interpretation than others and have had the budget to make these changes. The messages and interpretation often reflect the age and time of their creation. I spent 3 to 4 days at each site conducting my systematic participant observation, photographing each site and all the interpretive signage and displays, especially those conveying history and heritage and culture. When available, I participated in activities occurring at each site, such as cultural demonstrations or tours, and collected all interpretive and promotional materials made available to visitors. I took more than 3,600 photographs, which made up a total of 731 interpretive units for analysis. The results of analysis from these interpretive units served as my quantitative data. I conducted a total of 15 interviews based on the availability of participants at each site. These were with federal, state, and city employees, nonprofit employees, volunteers, and cultural practitioners. Interviews focused on each key consultant's knowledge of the space, its history, management, use, interpretation, and ability to meet the needs of diverse stakeholders while considering how site meaning is constructed and represented. These interviews served as my qualitative data and analysis. I completed the inductive content analysis of the research results in 2 parts. First, I analyzed photographs and texts of the displays, signage, interpretation and imagery from participant observation, interpretive materials, and audio tours to identify common themes, messages, and perspectives. I compared these results for similarities and differences across each of the sites. Second, I analyzed interview transcripts for key themes and variables, and then compared these results for similarities and differences across the sites, looking for common occurrences throughout all the interviews. Finally, I compared results from the participant observation and interviews. I reviewed these results for larger patterns in the data informed by literature, determining 5 major themes. I argue that while the majority of people working at case study sites recognize the need for demonstrating the differing and overlapping meanings of sites in their interpretation, the pre-established powers of the institutions that manage and interpret sites still largely influence the ways in which sites present information to visitors, often leaving out the voices of differing perspectives and memories. Many sites established at and after contact with have a historical colonial presence that still remains, and through this colonial dynamics of the past continue to impact government and Indigenous relationships today and affect the interpretation established at sites. I found 5 points that support this. 1, there is an established set of interpretive themes that control the stories told at sites. 2, there is a lack of shared authority between Indigenous peoples and government agencies in interpretation. 3, there is little sharing or blending of multiple ways of knowing in interpretation. 4, contemporary Indigenous relationships with sites are rooted in ancestral memories and connections. And 5, sites share their contemporary relationships with the public through live cultural programming. My first finding is that by and large, a set of established interpretive topics and themes controls the stories interpretation shares at research sites. The interpretive stories told to visitors include the themes of Indigenous peoples, non-Indigenous history, contact history, and nature and geology. While there is minimal interpretive focus on cultural continuity, contemporary peoples, and cultural education. Excluding or minimally interpreting contemporary relationships and peoples can be problematic since it reinforces a view of culture as static and unchanging, ignoring living people and the cultural importance of places, structures, and artifacts. The presence of these established interpretive themes suggests an established heritage site narrative that controls discourse and follows a larger constructed commemorative United States history narrative. Indigenous peoples was the most commonly used interpretive topic across the research sites. This discussion often focused on essentialized ways that Indigenous populations lived before and at contact with Euro-Americans, often exploring how they fed themselves, tools and weapons they used, the organization of societies and communities, and spiritual practices and belief systems. These stories are often shared in the past tense and with black and white imagery, as seen in these images. Sites focused on Hawaiian heritage still follow these patterns, discussing Hawaiian history and events, while also focusing on traditional beliefs and practices. Non-Indigenous history is the second most frequently used established interpretive topic, focusing on Euro-Americans' experiences in history. These discussions focus on the establishment and use of military and fur trading forts, the life of soldiers and fort residents, the exploration and establishment of Euro-Americans in the Northwest and Hawaii, and the establishment of missions. Another established interpretive topic is contact history. Discussion of this topic focuses on Euro-Americans' interactions with Indigenous populations during westward and Hawaiian Island exploration and establishment, fur trade efforts, roles, and relationships, and missionary and boarding school interactions with Indigenous populations. In many instances, contact history themes focused on Euro-American success or efforts in contact and collaboration with Indigenous populations. Nature and geology is the fourth established interpretive topic. This topic largely discusses regional plants and animals, the environment, bodies of water, geological features, and natural history, with a few instances discussing human interactions with the environment. Themes of nature and geology exhibit a common narrative of nature and its protection in American parks through the lens of Western conservation, where the land is seen as separate from humans. Tying this all together, these four interpretive themes provide a broad understanding of the history and people of sites, while fitting within an established narrative of US history that favors a larger common narrative and shared memory. This reinforces power dynamics and does not allow for other stories that do not fit the common US narrative to be told. Communities ignored or misrepresented in these common narratives may see these interpretations as degrading or incorrect, and by telling different narratives, sites can challenge common memories and narratives and expand their representations of the past. My second finding is that, in general, the stories at studied sites have little shared authority and are largely told by a generalized narrative voice that shares some authority in telling the story with Euro-American voices and very little with Indigenous peoples. My analysis results demonstrated that there is very little first-person voice present, with much more narrative voice. More Euro-Americans are named, and more Euro-Americans are cited and quoted. Voice is the perspective and style of communication and interpretation. A narrative voice is the most common, occurring in more than 3/4 of the interpretive units. Management and park voice was the second most frequently used. These two voices maintain authority in the site and its interpretation's all-knowing voice, giving little authority to the people discussed in and connected with that history. Euro-American voice is used slightly more than 5% of interpretive units, and Indigenous voice is used in less than 5% of interpretive units. In many instances, the use of Euro-American and Indigenous voice occurs as an interpretive unit that consists largely of quotes, as seen in the top image. And Indigenous voice also occurs in direct unquoted messages from Indigenous peoples or through traditional stories, as seen in the image on the right. Although Euro-American and Indigenous voice is used in some interpretive units, it's infrequent, resulting in a lack of shared authority. Of all named people in history and site interpretation, Euro-Americans make up nearly 2/3, while Indigenous people make up only 1/3. Many interpretive signs name several Euro-Americans while naming no or only one Indigenous person. At 3/4 of the studied sites, Euro-Americans in history are named more in interpretation than Indigenous peoples, with the exception of 3 sites, all with a distinct interpretive focus on Hawaiian heritage. I recognize that in some cases there may not have been names on record for Indigenous peoples, resulting in a greater number of named Euro-Americans, but by naming more Euro-Americans from history than Indigenous peoples, the interpretive content may be placing more emphasis on the importance of the roles of Euro-Americans in history, resulting in little shared authority with the Indigenous populations. Providing names of Indigenous peoples within interpretation can indicate their contribution and knowledge, demonstrating authority and self-representation. The most cited, quoted, and referenced group in the interpretive units at case study sites is Euro-Americans, making up almost half of all references, Less than a quarter of citations and quotes are from scientists, historians, newspapers, and other similar sources that provide more authority to the site and narrative voice. Also, less than a quarter of citations and quotes are from Indigenous peoples, with an additional small percentage of references from traditional Indigenous stories. This higher percentage of references from Euro-Americans provides more authority to Euro-Americans and less to the Indigenous populations. Indigenous people can have multiple identities and roles, allowing for the potential for Indigenous staff and scientists, for example, that could be part of citations and quotes that might not recognize or highlight their Indigenous identity. This was observed in Hawaiian parks that provided quotations from Hawaiian scientists in their interpretation. Although there may be a lack of physically documented history from Indigenous populations, there are still people who could potentially share this knowledge. As a whole, the use of narrative voice and little use of first-person voice, the high percentage of references from Euro-Americans, and the percentage of named Euro-Americans demonstrates that there's a lack of shared authority, with more authority given to Euro-Americans. In giving authority to tell the story of a site to general narrative voice, and Euro-American sites largely favor the Euro-American experiences of history. While quantitative data results revealed little shared authority in interpretation, qualitative data from interviews emphasized the need for living Indigenous and descendant voices and representation at sites. Interpretive staff voiced concern over the need to ensure interpretation, especially live interpretation, on Indigenous peoples comes from Indigenous peoples themselves rather than Euro-American interpreters, expressing concerns over permission, oversimplification, or destructive representation from improper presentation. Interview participants emphasized that sites should try to include Indigenous voices and perspectives at the forefront of printed and interpretive materials, especially local Indigenous voices. Many key consultants believed that emphasizing that Indigenous peoples are still living and present at sites is an important aspect of having Indigenous voice and perspectives. By sharing authority and voice with multiple populations, interpretation can better demonstrate the intricacy, variety, and nuances of cultures and history. And also, through shared authority and voice, heritage sites and cultural centers can bring Indigenous voices forward and create a space that Indigenous communities feel represented. As one Native Hawaiian interpreter shared, if I go to a place where there is a Native American presence and you see the Native American presence in the park, but then some white person comes and tries to tell you that story, that to me can sometimes be ineffective because it seems like it's not that person's voice or that person's place to tell the story. And sometimes you want to hear it from the face, that Native face. And I think when you do tell it from the perspective and it's a Native Hawaiian or a Native American Indian tribe that's sharing the story, it's powerful. It's way more powerful. But I think for some people, having the right face to the story is an experience in itself. My third finding is that stories told at studied sites appear to have little sharing or blending of multiple ways of knowing. This results from univocal interpretation that has little multivocality and minimal inclusion of negative contact history. Together, this shows that the majority of interpretive units share interpretive themes through a single voice and perspective without recognizing the potential for other perspectives and opinions, resulting in a lack of sharing or blending of ways of knowing. 3/4 of the interpretive units across the case study sites are univocal. Univocality provides a single voice or perspective on the interpretive theme presented. This type of interpretation seems neutral, but does not recognize the presence of different perspectives and ways of knowing. I selected case study sites based on their connection to multiple groups of people, which would suggest that there is variance in people's perspectives on the history of sites. Less than 1/4 of the interpretive units are multivocal. Multivocality allows for the presence of multiple voices or perspectives in interpretation, and the use of multivocality at the sites ranged from simply using terms or statements to suggest that there may be other perspectives, to sharing multiple perceptions in one statement, or to interpretive units that place different perspectives side by side as seen here. These different approaches to multivocality create an understanding that multiple perspectives, opinions, or ways of knowing are present at a site. But with less than 1/4 of interpretive units using multivocality, there is little blending or sharing of multiple ways of knowing. The interpretive topic of negative contact history also occurs in a small portion of the interpretive units. The negative contact history that is covered is not discussed in depth and is informational rather than experiential. Discussing negative parts of the past, such as war, violence, boarding schools, reservations, disease, and land destruction, can provide a better understanding of the different aspects of a site's history and the multiple perspectives people have of the past. By excluding negative contact history and focusing on neutral and positive aspects of contact, sites maintain a commemorative US narrative, present less diverse perspectives of the past, and lack a blending of multiple ways of knowing. In total, high univocality, little multivocality, and a lack of negative contact history maintain a single perspective and little recognition of the varied and overlapping history and meanings at each site, suggesting a lack of sharing of multiple ways of knowing in interpretation. While quantitative results reveal little sharing of multiple ways of knowing and interpretation, qualitative data emphasize the need for creating spaces, programs, and interpretation that support multivocal and balanced perspectives. Key consultants suggested that there are different ways of knowing, and people will each bring their own perspectives to a site, which can be considered an interpretation to create a story that demonstrates these different perspectives. Research participants emphasized a desire to find different ways to provide multiple perspectives in their interpretation, arguing for the use of audio, visuals, personal stories, and living history to tell multiple stories and opinions. Key consultants expressed understanding that there is no singular group perspective, but that each person within a community has their own view of what occurred in the past and present. Research participants identified the importance of balancing both negative and positive aspects of history to create conversations and potentially lead to better cultural understanding and healing. Including Indigenous and multiple voices and interpretation can help to encourage reflection and provide multiple perspectives that ensure that non-colonizer voices are expressed in places where they lack power. This can reduce bias, challenge misinformation, and address contested history in a meaningful manner. As one interpretive staff member at Hawaii Volcanoes explained of Thurston Lava Tube, it reminds me of the Confederate statues. Nahaku is the Hawaiian name that it was given. It's more of a contemporary name, but officially it's still the Thurston Lava Tube. This connects it to someone who has caused injustice and tragedy in Hawaii. My final two findings are interrelated and deal with the contemporary relationships and cultures of the studied sites. I can't go into depth on these 2 points at this time, but the interviews brought forward that the contemporary relationships or contemporary Indigenous relationships at sites are rooted in ancestral memories and connections and demonstrate how to maintain living connections through contemporary events and collaborations. There's a lot that can be learned from Hawaii, where sites have thriving events and relationships that keep culture alive and active at sites and maintain Native Hawaiian staff at in the parks. The annual Establishment Day celebration and cultural festival at Pu'ukohola National Historic Site celebrates the unification of the islands and Hawaiian heritage and is a great example of what sites can do. It's free to the public with only one stipulation, that each visitor learns at least one traditional skill before leaving to help preserve a part of the Hawaiian culture. There are private events, and early Saturday morning, a traditional ritual offering and dance are performed with the public allowed to attend. Demonstrations and cultural workshop activities follow the ceremony and continue in the next day with cultural demonstrations, Hawaiian food tasting, canoe rides, and performances throughout both days. This event, hosted with several partners, usually has large numbers of cultural demonstrators and public participants, and they welcome both Hawaiian and non-Hawaiian participants in their demonstrations. Visitors can learn skills such as lahala weaving, nose flute, and net making. Overall, my research found that one, an established set of interpretive themes control the stories told at sites. 2, there is a lack of shared authority between Indigenous peoples and government agencies. 3, there is little sharing or blending of multiple ways of knowing. 4, contemporary and Indigenous relationships with sites are rooted in ancestral memories and connections. And 5, sites share contemporary relationships with the public through live cultural programming. The majority of people working at studied sites identified the need for recognizing the overlapping roles of Indigenous history and memory of sites in their interpretation, but the pre-established powers of the institutions that manage and interpret the sites still largely influence the manner in which sites present information to visitors. The multiple and overlapping understandings of history of sites is lost in interpretation that follows common narratives, shares little authority, and lacks blended ways of knowing and multiple voices. Additionally, programming at sites recognizes some of the different memories and histories as it brings Indigenous voices to the sites. Places of heritage produce meaning and understanding of the past, and these heritage landscapes serve as sites of memory, belonging, knowledge, and identity negotiation. Heritage sites and cultural centers are a point of entry for Indigenous voices into mainstream society and can validate their histories, bringing Indigenous voices, multivocality, blended ways of knowing, stories outside the common US narrative, and a live Indigenous presence to sites can help to broaden the representation and perspectives of heritage sites and cultural centers. Recommendations from this project suggest ways for sites to improve interpretation, programming, and relationships. These recommendations are based on and informed by the data and findings of the study and can serve as feasible ways for changing heritage sites and cultural centers. Although sites might find aspects that need attention, there is a possibility for change and improvement in current interpretation and programming. In my report, I provide 38 different recommendations. I can give you a few now if people would like. Some sample recommendations include incorporating a welcome statement for Indigenous groups, making interpretation multivocal by including the voices of many, allowing and protecting cultural practices, and engaging in regular and open conversations with Indigenous populations. Thank you all for organizing this and for listening today. I can provide my references to anyone on request. And thank you to those who supported my research process through funding and mental support as well.
Mahalo, mahalo. So Leah, you did really great. That was really great. You gave us a lot of information. I was writing notes like crazy. Anyway, we have just a couple minutes, and Dr. Spoon and Aaron and Leah, you had a lot of the recommendations, and I wanted to hear from all of you, Dr. Jeremy and Aaron. I mean, some of the things that you saw with Leah's recommendations that you can highlight. I know I shared with you before we got started that I was listening to another speaker, and the speaker was talking about how building those relationships are very, very important, and that in the Native community, it's a pathway to sovereignty when your identity is affirmed. And also, as we talk about as Native Hawaiians living in this homeland, we really want to honor the people who have been stewards of this land for thousands and thousands of years. And so that also helps us create, we're just create a bond with them because we are just visitors. So when you talked a lot about multiple voices, and I love the voice of the land, and that one was very, very powerful when the land speaks, and then the people speak, and then the visitors, the colonizers speak. It's a really different story. So that really struck me as a really powerful recommendation. So Jeremy and Aaron, do you have anything you'd like to add on that one?
Sure. Leah, great job. And it was so wonderful to see all your wonderful research presented. There's so many great ideas in there that we're going to implement and operationalize in the world. A few things that I think are important that she brought up. Number one, just the mirrored land acknowledgement that all sites that are currently governed by U.S. Different land management agencies, the Park Service, the Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, that they acknowledge that those lands are the ancestral and traditional homelands of Indigenous peoples, and that they do that in ways that show a sharing of authority like Leah was talking about. So that the visitor comes in there and understands that it's more than public land, it's land that is Indigenous lands that they are guests on, and with them bringing a level of respect that maybe they didn't see before without knowing that connection. The other piece is, right now we're at a time where we're talking about social justice and equity. And as a form of equity, I think it's really important to talk about other ways of knowing and the authority that we give to them. And in Leah's project, she really showed how there's certain knowledge that gets told and other knowledge might not be told as much. And we see this kind of done in a particular way through only talking about Indigenous peoples in the past, using black and white photographs, using the past tense, not talking about contemporary thriving Indigenous peoples. So I think that, you know, Leah gave us a little bit of the inside of how this process is going, and so that we can change it and disrupt it to think about equity as representing different cultures and their different ways of seeing the land, so that we can then have more plurality and understanding. So those are the 2 points I'd like to point out. And Leah's research is going to be used in multiple ways, and her work on it will live on. And so, yeah, wanted to share that.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. Leah, did we have any questions from the chat, or because I mean, she was very clear on a lot of her information. Did you get any questions that we want to share?
The only question was if this presentation will be available to be seen again. And I did answer it will be. Also, we provided Leah's link to the full research, to the full project, and so that you can also find that in the.
That's great. That's
yeah.
great.
So no questions yet.
Okay, well, mahalo, Leah, very much. Mahalo, Dr. Spoon, for you two getting together and bringing the information here. So why don't we wrap this up? It looks like, you know, we have a couple of minutes here. And if Aaron, if you want to make a comment or any questions, go ahead. The floor is yours now.
Thank you, Auntie Louise, and thank you, Leah, for a great presentation. I'd like to follow up on what Dr. Spoon mentioned about, you know, first steps is land acknowledgement. And so I have some information on wherever you are at, so that you can know the Native Indigenous peoples that have lived on and the history of that land. You can either go to the website nativegov.org and search land acknowledgement, or I have a phone number that you can input into your phone, and I've saved it as tribes by region. And the number is 907-312-5085. And if you send a text to that number of either the zip code or the city and state that you're at, a bot will respond with information about the Native Indigenous peoples who once lived there. To find out more information, once you've accessed that, then you'll know the Indigenous tribes. You can either research those tribes, or you could go to nps.gov, which is nationalparkservices.gov, to find out information on local national parks, such as the Fort Vancouver site. And if you have any information, or if you'd like to find out more about Ka'ahalahui O'Olekona Hawaiian Civic Club of Oregon and Southwest Washington, you can also go to our website at kalohcc.org.
Did you mute yourself, Aaron? I think we didn't hear what you just said, or maybe you froze on us. Okay. All right. Okay, we'll get you back later. Okay. Okay, so what we're going to do, thank you, mahalo again, Leah, mahalo, Dr. Spoon. We're going to need to do a little bit of, talk a little bit more about some of the events that we are having planned that you can join us with. And so Leah, we'll take it back to you, and you can share some of those upcoming events. All right. I think. There you go.
Yeah, sorry. Aʻo Mai. Yeah, so just wanted to share a little bit. Again, we are Ka'alahui O'olekona, and definitely our mission is to perpetuate our native and not only perpetuate, to uplift our native Hawaiian community as well, and to honor the land which we are on. And we wanted to bring this information to you folks. We do have an upcoming event on Kala'umikumokolu o Pepelualis on the 13th of February, and it is a workshop. And Kalmai, I am sharing it to you, Makololo Hawaii, and I will switch it over to Makololo Pelikania. But we wanted to honor as well as our language and to honor our people, but we need you folks to come out to our workshop. And it is the Pacific Islander Heal program, and it is through our Pacific Islander Data Modernization project, that Kalo is hosting. And so again, that information is available on our website as well, and that is on Saturday, February 13th. And much like we heard with Leah, a lot of our voices need to be heard in both historically, within history, with our Aina, and also within our communities. And so we just wanted to share this information, and we hope that you will register and join us. And this is open to everyone, not just members of Kalo, but to everybody via our website, again, which Erin had already pointed out, kalohcc.org for more information. And again, just brief mahalo and to Louise. Okay, and mahalo again to Leah and Jeremy and Auntie Louise and Erin to bringing this, and mahalo to our members for allowing us to have opportunities like this to share these mo'olelos and these stories, and to make connections like this with our hoas of Fort Vancouver, as well as at Portland State University. So, and again, and for more information on how to become a member, again, visit kalohcc.org. And if you want more information for the project, that research from Leah, please visit the website. It is in the chat, and we will have that information available on our website as well. And so to close it all, and I want to bring again Auntie Louise, there they are, Auntie Louise and Erin, they're here, and he oli mahalo kia. And if everybody could just help us close the event together. Here are the words, and it's a simple oli, just say it out, and again, your intentions to close this day, and to mahalo Leah for her work, and really uplifting the voices and the history and the now of our people. So of our Kanaka of Hawaii, as well as here's Mokuhonu. So let us ho'omaka. Mahalo e ka lehulehu, mahalo e nā mākua, mahalo e nā kūpuna, mahalo e nā ali'i, mahalo e nā au mākua, mahalo e nā ākua, mahalo e. So again, mahalo nui o ko apau, mahalo for joining us. And we want to leave you with a little bit of mana'o, Hawaii. Tomorrow, Kalamai. Tomorrow is a celebration of Keali'i William Lunalilo. He was our first elected monarch of Hawaii, and tomorrow is his lahanau. And so we wanted to leave you with that, and we're going to leave you with a mele entitled Ale Koki, which is a mele written by the great Keali'i Lunalilo. Nalela mahalo ya o ko apau, and have a beautiful weekend. Yay! Good job, guys.
You can stop the recording.
Oh yeah, I forgot that. Like trying to remember everything that I have to turn off.